A warm welcome to you all. My name is Antje and I'm an associate editor of the Journal of Small Business Management. I'm grateful for today for the opportunity to talk with Professor Cohen about his paper titled Beyond Educating Students About Business Failure, the Role of Optimism, Training and Hope. The paper has been co-authored by him together with his colleagues Dan Su and Rachel Shinnar. Dan is the Whittaker Executive Director and Professor of Entrepreneurship at the Wake Forest University in the United States. The paper has been first published online November 2023 in the Journal of Small Business Management. Welcome, Dan.
Antje, thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks for joining us. Dan, I have a question where the idea for this paper came from.
Well, it was kind of what I think of as a perfect storm. I measure my students' entrepreneurial mindset every semester. And one of the components of that measurement is their state optimism. And I was struck by how pessimistic my students were. And it surprised me. And in my way of thinking, I'm an entrepreneur by background. I was an entrepreneur first that built and sold a company. And then I went back and I got my PhD. And then I transitioned to being a professor of entrepreneurship. And in my way of thinking, everyone else is pessimistic. Investors are pessimistic. They don't think that the market's big enough. They're not sure that the product or service is going to get traction. They don't think that the customers will like it. And so a lot of times investors are very pessimistic. Customers are very pessimistic. It's too big. It's too small. It's not fast enough. It's too fast. And so I thought the entrepreneur can't afford to be pessimistic. The entrepreneur needs to be optimistic. So the first thing was measuring how pessimistic my students were. And then the second thing was I went to pick my son up who was at his friend's house. And while I was waiting for him to gather his things, I was conversing with his friend's mother, who's a neurologist. And she pulls out this book, The Optimistic Child by Martin Seligman. And she said, "Have you read this book?" And I said, "No, I haven't. I've heard of Martin Seligman, of course, is a pretty famous author." I said, "I've heard of him, but I haven't read the book." She goes, "Well, in it, there's a test, and I gave it to my children, and they're very pessimistic." And so she said, pessimism has a lot of ill effects on your health. And she started to explain the ill effects that pessimism has on your health. And initially, I went home and I read that book just to be a better parent. And but as I started to read it and I started to think about my students' pessimism, I started thinking this is not good for entrepreneurship. We need to figure out a way to develop optimism in our students. And as the more I read about it, I came to understand that it's a skill. It's a cognitive ability that you can improve and develop. And so in the beginning, I thought, I'm just going to try to develop optimism in my students. That was the beginning point, and ultimately it led to the creation of this experiment and this paper.
It is so fascinating to learn more about the background, how the idea came together. In terms of the theoretical contribution, what do you think is most important for people to remember?
Yeah, so I think the paper makes a number of contributions. The first is that, failure is inherent in entrepreneurship, and there's so much uncertainty. You don't know what customers are going to want until you put it in front of them, and you could be too early, like we saw with a lot of tech startups in the early 2000s. Like Instacart is successful now, but in 2000 there was a company called Webvan. Same kind of thing. They were just too early. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why failure happens in entrepreneurship. And other scholars, like I think of Dean Shepard, has done a lot of great work researching failure. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to see the effect that optimism training could have as a coping mechanism to help nascent entrepreneurs learn how to cope with failure, because it's just part and parcel of the entrepreneurial experience. And so we know from previous research that failure it can dampen an entrepreneur's willingness to engage in future entrepreneurial activity. And a lot of times it will cause entrepreneurs to not be entrepreneurs anymore, to go and seek wage employment. And so what we learned from this study was that optimism helped students cope with entrepreneurial failure But another contribution to the study is that failure had previously been studied as a dichotomous variable. It had been either you failed or you didn't fail. In this case, we measured gradients of failure. We measured a heavy failure and a light failure. And one of the things that we hypothesized was that optimism would help the treatment group that had been trained in optimism cope with light failure, but that optimism training is not some sort of magic pill that will make everything better. If you listen to the critics of optimism, they'll say that people are Pollyanna. They have unfounded optimism. They think everything's going to be okay no matter what. And so what we wanted to do as part of this experiment was to test the limits of optimism. And we hypothesized that the treatment group would cope with the light failure in a significant way, and we found that. But we also said that it would have a much less of an effect on the heavy failure. So optimism is a great thing. We believe that this paper shows the importance of optimism. It leads to sustained hope. It leads to resilience and not quitting. It leads to giving entrepreneurship another go and trying it again in the future. But it's not, as I said before, it's not a magic bullet that you can just take it and everything's going to be okay. There are limits to optimism. And so those are some of the big theoretical contributions that I think we made in the paper.
These are very important theoretical insights, so I appreciate you share them with us.
Sure.
Of course, the paper here, it will also have important implications for policymakers and practitioners. So what advice would you give them?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's face it, globally, entrepreneurship is vital to GDP. It's vital to economic growth, and it's just extremely important component of any nation's economy. And so, if failure can wipe out entrepreneurs, particularly serial entrepreneurs, it could have a devastating effect worldwide on economies. And so one of the big things, just from a geopolitical standpoint, is that if we know that optimism is a mechanism that can help entrepreneurs hold on and sustain hope and give it another go, that in and of itself is a big impact in terms of insights to practice and policymakers. And granted, this study was done in the United States, where we have a cultural acceptance of entrepreneurship, which means that we have a cultural acceptance of failure. We also have a lot of strong institutional support, like the ability to go bankrupt and not pass debts down to heirs. We just have an acceptance of failure that may not exist in other nations. And so I think that this study shows the importance of embracing failure as part of the entrepreneurial process. There's no way to avoid it because it's such an uncertain process. And this paper helps give policymakers some insight as to how they can spread this message that optimism can help sustain hope, and can help entrepreneurs feel like they can, if they did fail, that they can give it another go. However, again, there are limits to this, because if it's a large failure, what happens is it suppresses the entrepreneur's learning, and it makes them personalize the failure, and it makes them scared of taking chances again in the future. But the smaller failures, the failure you see much more often in entrepreneurship, optimism works, and it's a great path forward. So I think that it's very useful to people that teach entrepreneurship, people that practice entrepreneurship, and that government officials that make policy around entrepreneurship.
Really interesting. Then are there any other thoughts you would like to share with us before we come to a close?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious. You're an associate editor, and you read a lot of different papers. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on failure and how we can help, especially student entrepreneurs, not be so afraid of it? That's been one of the concerns, is that entrepreneurship education may be scaring students off. And so I'll just turn the tables and I'll be the interviewer here. I'd love to hear your take on that.
It is such a good question, and I really appreciate it. In terms of education, I think about a lot, because if you compare some Asian cultures, and I have a paper related on optimism in Vietnam, you can really see how optimism can help a whole society to strive against perhaps uncertainty. And I believe in these complex times, the topic becomes much more important because the world becomes more unstable and people really have to embrace failure because it is less predictable. So yes, I think the topic is definitely important. I don't have a solution how to do that, but in my teaching, I try in a way to just create a very constructive environment where people feel empowered to share their ideas and be creative. And also we talk in our MBA classes a lot about the importance of failure, and in entrepreneurship for innovation, it's part of the process, as you said. So yeah, no, really important. I hope we will see more papers in that area coming through.
I hope so too. So I'll now I'll attempt to answer your question about what else we want to discuss. One of the things that I found very interesting in this line of inquiry was, and I've just anecdotally, I've asked people this question: which party is more divorced from reality, optimists or pessimists? And the answer that I get most frequently is that optimists are more divorced from reality. But the research says that's not so, and that pessimists, even though they know that the worst case scenario happening is probably a low probability, for whatever reason, they fixate on that worst case like a negative feedback loop, and they just focus on the worst case scenario happening, even though they know there's a low probability of it occurring. And so actually pessimists are more divorced from reality than optimists. That was something that was kind of eye-opening to me. I never thought that was the case. I kind of lean more towards the camp of optimists or Pollyanna and everything's going to be fine. And it turns out the pessimists are more removed from reality than optimists. That was eye-opening to me. And then the second thing that I'll say is that I came away from this research with a lot of empathy for people that are pessimistic, because, and particularly my students that are pessimistic, because they really are tortured souls. Because if something good happens, they think that someone else is responsible. But if something bad happens, they think they caused it. And so I came away with a lot of empathy, again, particularly regarding my students. And I really am kind of on a crusade to help figure out ways to make them be more optimistic, not just because of the importance to entrepreneurship, but Seligman's work found in study of thousands of 8 to 14-year-old children over 30 years that training and learned optimism statistically eliminates anxiety and depression in that group of children that experienced the optimism training. And so I think that this optimism training could have greater effect on society, even above and beyond entrepreneurship.
Fantastic. That was really inspiring, and I'm really grateful that we had the chance to talk about this important paper. Thank you, Dan, for these insights.
Oh, Antje, absolutely my pleasure. And thank you for asking me such good questions. I appreciate it.
Great. I'm sure the readers now want to read the full paper, and I just want to point out it's available at the Taylor and Francis website of the Journal of Small Business Management. So I hope we will see some more clicks. I really enjoyed learning from you. So nice to meet you. Thanks again. All the best, and I hope to have future papers coming through in that area. Thank you, Dan.
My pleasure, Antje. Thank you.